Hi, I'm Chris Colvin. I'm the founder of IvyLife. One of the things that we've been doing in recent times is doing IvyLife Masterclasses, where we invite longtime IvyLife members to share the expertise that they've developed in their chosen field. So in tonight's masterclass, I'm really excited to have Antoine of Antoine Education here. A little personal note, I am the father of twins who are seniors in high school. So almost exactly a year ago, I called Ed, probably sounding a little bit nervous and wondering, well, when should my kids start, should they take the SAT or the ACT? When should they start prepping, et cetera, et cetera. Ed immediately put me at ease, and he really helped my kids feel prepared, be prepared, and made the process not only a successful one, but one that made them comfortable. So I really, having had that experience, I thought it'd be great to share with my successors in stress, those who have juniors and younger high schoolers who are about to go through the process that I went through ×2 last year. So to start out, Ed, maybe you could share, I know like me, you were a Princeton Aerospace Engineering major, which I liked you already once I knew that. But how did you, tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you get from there, being a Princeton Aerospace Engineer, to being a test prep expert?
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. And I did, as Chris mentioned, I studied aerospace engineering at Princeton. But ironically, well before I ever started working professionally as an engineer, while still a sophomore at Princeton, I started teaching SAT prep. And it was just a simple, I had an on-campus job that paid minimum wage. And I saw an ad for teaching SAT prep that paid 3 times that. And, I applied my logical skills and took the job. And the long story short, even teaching SAT prep as a sophomore and junior, and I did it sophomore, junior year, I just found it fun and interesting. And I remember watching the guy who ran the business, and I thinking it like, wow, this would be a great business, running an SAT prep course. And it was many years before I ended up, committing myself to working full-time as a test prep. But, at Princeton as a sophomore and junior, I was watching this guy thinking, wow, that's kind of neat. I think I might like to run a test prep business someday. So again, my senior year, I actually worked for another Princeton grad who did get out of Princeton and founded a test prep business out on Long Island. And I actually worked for him senior year and a couple times in the future. But most of my post graduate life, I worked for an oil company as an engineer and in technical marketing. Took an interlude to run a test prep course on the West Coast. Actually, one of the branches of my friends in Long Island, his course out in LA. Then I worked for 10 years in software in New York City, mostly writing applications for bond traders. And when at some point I decided, I think I want to do something different. And I just kind of fell right back into test prep. And at that point I thought, and I talked to some people, like, I like doing it. There's clearly a market for it. People appreciate the service. So I just made the commitment to stick with it. And so that's kind of how I ended up where I am now, was just something I enjoy doing that was clear that people wanted the service. So I decided I'll just provide it.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for sharing that story. It's everything. I guess you went full circle back to the test.
I did.
So that's great. So here I'm going to jump right into it. And I formulated some questions. These are basically the questions I asked Ed a year ago when I was trying to figure out how to help my kids prepare. So first of all, there's all this stuff about test optional. So just the basic threshold question is, should my kid take the SATs or not, or the ACTs?
Yeah, now that's a question that a lot of people are going to ask, and I think, and have asked themselves over the last couple of years. And I think, depending on your circumstance, you're going to answer it a different way. But I would say for pretty much everyone, plan A should be to take the SAT or ACT and try to get a competitive score, because a competitive score will only help you. So, and I've worked with many people who've done this. The goal has been to get a score that they felt would get them an advantage for admissions. And, and then it's at some point you have to make a judgment call about, whether or not you should send the score. But I definitely think it is, in your interest for your child to try to get a competitive score that can give an advantage in admissions. Test optional remains an option, but it's like any other element. Well, I say it's like other elements of your application where you're trying to distinguish yourself, but it is a singularly focused element where you really do have an opportunity to distinguish yourself from a lot of other applicants that on paper might look very similar. But if you can just give that little, move the needle a little bit just because you have a better SAT score, it's definitely worth effort to do that.
Right. And
Just don't.
that's a good point, Ed, because I think before I went through the process with my kids, I didn't realize they were starting to talk about test optional stuff. And I didn't quite realize that it's really two steps. You take the test, you see how you do.
Right.
And then for certain schools,
Yeah.
For quite a few schools currently, you can decide not to submit. So it's not like you take it, you get the score, and then it automatically goes to the schools. You still control what schools it goes to, right? So,
Yeah, you do have to be sure that you're not sending it. You don't send it automatically. You
Right.
wait, you get the score back, and you make a decision. And it can be different for different schools. You send it to schools where you think it'll give you a competitive advantage, and you may not send it to other schools where you don't think it will.
Right. And because I just went through this and I learned it, there's something called the College Board website, which the parents and the kids both have access to. And you can say, there's this thing called, you can send 3, quote unquote, free test scores to the College Board. The trouble is you have to decide before they take the test. So it's a
Right.
little bit of it feels like a little bit of I didn't like that idea because you don't know how the kid's going to do. So
Well,
we didn't do that. We did not send the 3 free ones because, we wanted to retain that control of deciding when to send them and if to send them, right?
yeah, you
So,
definitely want to retain that control. I mean, it's in the College Board interest for colleges to consume that, their scores. So they want to encourage that, but it's not, you want to retain control and decide which colleges see that your test scores.
got it. So it's kind of a no-brainer. Take the test, hopefully do well.
Yep.
As we're going to discuss later tonight, seriously think about a formal test prep program because that will help with the score. And then you still retain that power. So how about which one? So once it's clear that these kids should be, kids that want to get into top schools should at least take a test. And they should prepare for it. But which one? Should they take the SAT or the ACT? And how do they decide?
Yeah, now this is, at this point, it's pretty much every college is going to take either. They're open to taking either score. And you can distinguish, the only way to really make a informed decision about that is to do a practice test of each, a full-length practice SAT, a full-length practice ACT. Now, second best to that is your PSAT score. And there are an increasing number of schools that offer what's called the pre-ACT.
Okay.
I see them a little bit on the East Coast, but they're out there. But what you have to do is you take the score and you look at what percentile that score is in, what percentile ranking it would be in, and you compare the percentile rankings. And then you say, well, would my child end up in a higher ranking on the SAT or the ACT? Now, for most students, it's going to be very close. It's going to be within a percentage point or two because the tests they're similar. They're certainly not identical, but they're similar. And, your skills, your demonstrated skills on the test are going to fall in roughly the same range versus your peers on both tests. And I think there's a perception that they're so different that some kids are just naturally better at one or naturally better at others. Well, there are some, there may be 15%, 15 to 20% of kids are clearly going to do or somewhat clearly going to do better on one than the other. So it can be worth the time to take both, but most likely you're going to find that, I think I may even be overstating the ones who are, it's more like 10 to 15% are going to
Right.
do better
But if
on
they
that.
take if they take the PSAT in their school, as most kids do that as a matter of course, at
Yes.
the end of sophomore year, my kids, because the pandemic did it at the beginning of junior year, but most parents will have their kids will take it spring of sophomore year. And if they do well on that, that's a good indicator. Is that a good indicator that they should favor the SAT because that's going to be a better model?
Now,
Or
this is the thing is that, and I've told this to many people, is if you get a PSAT score that suggests to you, that you can get the SAT score you need, then you don't have to go beyond the SAT. Like, you can get what you want from the SAT. Now, again, does that mean that you couldn't do better on the ACT? Well, maybe you could, but I really encourage people always to think the test is a means to an end. You always want to keep the end in mind. The end is not necessarily getting any particular score. It's having a score that's going to support your application and make you competitive against the other applicants.
well, the other day at one of my kids' soccer games, a parent with a sophomore asked me, well, should my kid take both the SAT and the ACT? What's your view? I mean, I guess,
That's a big fat no.
okay, I thought so. That's
Yeah.
what I told her. I'm like, I don't know. I don't think that's a good idea. And I think if I
No,
tried to do that, my kids would have rebelled, I think. So
that's a lot of time and effort. I mean,
yeah,
well, the key thing is if you're willing to do that, it's probably because you're looking to prep.
yeah,
If you're just going to walk in, that's fine.
right. But if you're prepping, yeah, okay,
Yeah.
good. Now, that leads me to when should people's kids be taking the test? I think there's a sitting in December usually, then there's some in the spring, the summer. When should a kid take the test?
My feeling is that kids should be thinking about taking the test in the spring of their junior year.
Okay.
And when I say spring, I should say second semester, because the first time they're going to take it most likely will be, what's officially still winter, like a February, March.
Okay.
February for the ACT, March for the SAT. So you're going to take, for most, you're going to want to think about starting your prep at least 2-3 months before the test date.
Okay.
For your first attempt. And now I'm talking about the broad, this is like a kind of a standard like program.
Right.
Now, but you're taking it the first time in that early, late winter, early spring. And most likely they'll be taking it again later in the spring. So, you might be taking a May SAT or a June, ACT.
Got it.
And typically you're going to be looking at 2 or 3 months of prep before the first time you take it. And I do kind of encourage this kind of like having a reasonable run up. Like it can get very stale prepping for 4 to 6 months before you go in for the real thing. And again, I do proctored practice exams, which kind of like try to keep it real in terms of like where you're at, what you're likely to get. But at the same time, I feel like after 3 months, you're ready to go in there and try it out for the real thing and see how you're doing. Although you should know about what you're going to score on that test. And you also know if you're going to continue studying after you've taken that test. But for most kids, within 6 months, 2 to 3 months before a first attempt, maybe another 2 months, 2 or 3 months before a second attempt, that's enough time to get ready. I mean, for a student who's been reasonably, diligent in their studies and is willing to put effort into prep.
Right. And Ed, I remember a year ago when I asked you some of these same questions, one of the things you said was, don't start too early. Like I had twins. So one kid really wanted to get it over with. So they started studying right about a year ago. I started prepping with Ed, and then they took the December test. And my other kid was like, are you joking? So they took it in March and they started prepping right after the new year. So I think if you have a kid that really wants to get it done in December, that's a probably unusual situation, but you would start basically now, right? And then
I was going to say, it's becoming every year people prep earlier. So I would say 3 years ago, I would have said it was unusual, but every year I talk to people earlier, I start working with students earlier. So there is a growing cohort who are basically coming out of junior year saying, okay, I want to get started and I want to get done. And honestly, I don't, for students who are pretty advanced, who, are willing to start in August or September, and be done by December, that's a good plan too. That can be a good plan, but
Yeah,
typically it's only for a student who's looking for a really high score and can get onto a track that within the 2-3 months before the December test, they're likely to get.
yeah. And if you
The score
start
they,
prepping too early, you're gonna start forgetting stuff like, so it's like,
yeah, you're gonna have to repeat. You're gonna have to be going over stuff again. You don't really want to do that.
yeah,
That's like starting too early. You start too
yeah,
early, and then your test prep tutor is teaching stuff that they were going to learn in class a month or two later.
yeah,
And really, as a test prep tutor, I want to be in the position of reinforcing. I don't want to have to introduce topics. I want to reinforce and clarify and solidify, rather than say, oh, this is the first time you've seen this. That's not the ideal situation for me or for the student.
So one of the questions that I know I had is sort of related to this is how do I know how many times should a kid take the test, and how do they know, you know what I mean? Because
Right.
some kids, especially, I think, this Ivy Life is for Ivy League alumni, so they tend to have high ambitions for themselves and their children.
Right.
And so how many times should a kid take a test before they just sort of say, okay, this is the score, I'm going to stick with it? Because I think there's this tendency sometimes to think, well, I did well, but maybe I could do even better, right? So
Right.
how do you decide how many times?
Well, I do think it is kind of like you try to have a goal. I definitely encourage people to have a goal. I discourage the idea of, the best possible. I think it's
Right.
it's good to have, even if your goal is very high. People come in with 1550. I want a 1550. That's a very high score. You can have 1550 as a goal, but I think that's better than, it's I've had students get 1550s and take it again, but I don't think they're really, you're not buying a whole lot at that point, but have a goal. And typically, if you're willing to do, like I said, that essentially 3 to 6 months of prep, most students are able to get to their goal in that time frame. And if you don't, then clearly there's now an August test. There's the fall for seniors. You know, so I guess there's, until you hit your goal, there's no keep taking it. I mean, I must admit, I'm a little bit like, if you set a goal and it's a rational goal and it's going to help your admissions, if you don't get it in the first 2 times, even though I hope and expect you will, go ahead and take it again.
Got it. If the kid's up for it, right? And
they're up
you
for
don't, you obviously don't want their grades to falter because they're spending so much time prepping for a test.
Well, the key thing is, that's why I so encourage people to take it seriously early, get it done in the spring, then you can focus on so many other things, whether it's the grades, your applications, ideally you're not spending senior year worrying about your test scores.
Right. So one thing I learned in working with you was about super scores. I'd never heard of that before. So for the parents of high schoolers, can you explain like what a super score is, what it means?
Well, super score essentially is when the schools, since you can take the test multiple times and each test has different sub scores. So the SAT has 2 scores, a math and a verbal score, and the ACT has 4 scores. English, reading, science, and math. When they take your top score in each section from all of your sittings and then combine them together, they call that a super score. And for a lot of kids, when you're shooting for a certain goal, whether I'll just use 1500 for the SAT, if you're shooting for a 1500, maybe you might get 1450 twice. But if you got 750 math and 700 verbal the first time, but the next time you get 750 verbal and 700 math, you can combine your top 2 750s and now you have 1500. That's what's called your super score. And I would say that the colleges have been pretty clear that they now look at super scores. The ACT even did a study that suggested that the super score was better aligned, like a better predictor of academic performance. So they very much blessed it as actually after the College Board, they kind of said, yes, we agree with the super score. And the schools mostly say that that's what they'll use. So, and I've even heard from people, I don't know these systems that well, but there's certain systems that are used at colleges and the admissions offices where, all the important numbers are plugged into a system. And so your profile, they're not actually looking at all, your 2, 3, 4 score reports. They're looking at the composite. Like
Right.
your profile says that's your SAT score.
Right.
So it's not like that's what they see.
Otherwise, the admissions process would never be done because they
Exactly. If they had to sift through every document you sent in. So
yeah, so I'll just add, because I'm literally about to work with my kids to go through the actual application process since I have senior twins. And the way it works is there's kind of 3 buckets. There's schools that look at all the scores, want you to submit all the scores for the sittings. If you took it 3 times, they want to see them all. There's a handful of schools that want that. They tend to be kind of super elite type of schools. Then there's another category where they look at a very small group that looks only at your best single sitting. There's only a handful of those, I think, but I think one of my kids is applying to one of those. And then there's the most you can submit individually, and you literally get on the Common App website and you submit one for one and the other for the other, right? Like 1 verbal and 1 math in the case of the SAT. And there's a very high number of schools now that accept that, including some of the really competitive schools. But there are those 3 buckets. I think Ed's right that the biggest bucket now is the super score bucket, I think, is from what I can tell. So let's see. I think we have a couple questions. All right, someone asked, I don't know if they might need to clarify, but they say, what level of math should I have completed for the SAT and or ACT? I think they mean
no, I think I know what that means.
What courses should they have taken to be
Yes,
ready?
what courses should they have taken?
Yeah.
And the answer is pretty much algebra 2. And a lot of times too, when that's pretty much it, is algebra 2.
Okay.
And at that point, and it's an interesting thing that's happening with a lot of tutors, is that we didn't really want to work with younger 10th graders, younger kids, but more and more younger kids are coming who've already completed algebra 2. They've already done all the math that's on the test.
Right.
And there is something of an advantage to, once you've completed all the math that's on the test, going ahead and taking it.
Yeah.
Because I've had students who were in calculus, or sometimes even the second year of calculus, and going back and doing all that algebra to get ready for their SAT is just, they find it really a pain.
Yeah, my kid that took it in December had I think algebra 2 in 9th grade or something, so it was already starting to fade. So it's like,
yeah,
why not get it done sooner, before it fades even further, right?
yeah.
So,
Once algebra 2 is under their belt, they're ready to go. And I mean, it's not even like, so many kids are in algebra 2 when they're taking the SAT. That's fine. But once
you need that's a good reason to get some prep in, because you might not quite have finished it. So I have a few questions that, please pop additional questions into the chat window, but I'm going to sort of go now to some questions that sort of relate to, more generally to the test process. And these are some of the things I think I asked you, Ed. So one thing, the impression that I've been getting throughout this college application process, including the test prep, is that it seems a lot harder to get into Ivies and other elite schools today than it did, 30 whatever years ago when I was applying. I get the sense like I would never get into an Ivy today, but so is that what about that? Is that true, or is that a myth? What's happening with, are these schools truly getting much harder to get into?
Well, they are getting harder to get into. There's no question they're getting harder to get into, but I think a lot of that is population pressure. The size of the classes have not expanded as the population of the applicant pool has expanded. or as rapidly as the applicant pools it. So there are more students applying, to the same, group of schools, selective schools. And so, yes, it's from on a percentage basis, yes, there fewer percentage are getting admitted. And I think it's also very true that, kids are taking more AP classes than ever. The whole game, the focus on getting into these schools has just kind of heated up over the past, 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So I don't think there's any question that it's a more competitive. And then you throw in, I would say also the almost the gamesmanship of the schools themselves of doing all they can to encourage applicants, because they want to encourage applicants so that they can, the more applicants they get, the more people they can deny, and the more selective they become on a numerical basis. And that's to their advantage in the ranking systems, that they're super selective. But yes, absolutely. It's getting harder. There are more students chasing, it's not the same number of seats, but it has not grown at the pace of the population. Right. And the kids applying have a lot more experience. They're more academically prepared than they were when we were applying to college. And I don't remember how many APs I took, but it certainly isn't like the kids today who were basically, sophomore, like 9 AP. I certainly didn't take 9 or 10 AP classes in I was on a reasonably advanced track.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of gamesmanship on the part of the schools in the sense that they're casting a very broad net, maybe even encouraging people to apply that have a very small chance of getting in. But there's also I don't want to say that the students are gaming, but they are in feeling the pressure to take lots of APs, to do a lot of prep. And that is sort of, fortunately or unfortunately, that is sort of where we are as a society, right? You do need to do a lot of, to work hard to get into these sort of top tier schools. Are there, that leads me to another question, which is, if my, let's say a kid is, how, and you'll learn this, if you're a parent of high schools, you'll figure this out. There's lots of ways. If you have Naviance, a lot of schools have Naviance, you can do a Naviance, but you can also just Google it. They have this like mid 50% range. And that means that 50% of the kids they admit are between X and Y, say on the SAT. And then they do the same thing for SAT and ACT, excuse me. So if my kid's below that 50% margin, they're above it, fine. That's probably a good thing. They're below it. Does that mean they're just wasting their time applying to these types of super elites?
Well, the key thing is, do you have something to offset that? Is there a reason to think you're going to be let in, despite that score? And again, a lot of times, if you know that your score, I'll answer it 2 ways. One is, if you know your score is going to be in the bottom quartile,
right?
Your score is going to be in the quartile. Number one, you have the option not to send it. At least now, and maybe at least for another year, you probably have the option not to send it. That may go away, but right now you have the option not to send it. But you also, by sending it, there is one reason to send it, which is to demonstrate that it wasn't that it was just below, not way below.
Yeah.
like your SAT or ACT score does validate that you're capable of handling the academic rigor at the school. That is a reason to send it. But again, if you are applying in that situation, you've got to have some sense that you're bringing something to the table that they want that has nothing to do with your test score. And at the same time, I will say that most of the schools, and some of them are very clear about this, if they want you for that other reason, they would just as well you not send the SAT score. Because they're like, that's not why we're accepting you. So at least while they're test optional, you wouldn't send that score. But again, I do think there is that element of, you do want to, they have a college readiness index. Both the ACT and the SAT have a college readiness index.
Right.
And they're, for some kids, they're trying to get above the college readiness index. So colleges believe that they can handle the work.
Right, and it's a little outside the scope of this discussion, but just so people know, an example where that comes up, where you might be below the cutoff or in the lower quartile, below the 25% line, and the school might not want you to submit. One of my kids is interested in playing college athletics, and he was told by someone in the know that sometimes they'll pair kids, like they'll get a kid with really high scores and they'll say, well, we're recruiting this kid, and that will almost help them recruit someone who's probably below that level. And they need to balance it out. They need some real, there's student athletes with emphasis on the student, and then there's some that are student athletes with the emphasis on the athletes, and some are both, so they do take kids. I mean, that's why it's the lower quintile, because they actually get in, right? Those are
they got in. Those kids
they got in that lower 25%. Somehow they got in. So, but they do need some kind of plus factor. Sometimes that's sport, sometimes it's something else, some demonstration of leadership and whatnot. So that's something to definitely look into, though. So, but I think if you don't have any kind of plus factor and just have so-so grades, you're in that lower quartile, that's an iffy proposition. You might want to save your kid the pain, so because it's a lot of work doing all the applications and the supplemental essays. So let's see, and Ed, go ahead. I'm just looking to see if
what I was going to say was, and when I talked about goals earlier, about setting goals for schools you're applying to, it's that top quartile. If you can look and identify that top quartile and say, well, if I can get a score in the top quartile, I'm going to give myself a competitive advantage in my application to this school. So there is a degree to, you want to that's at least one number you can have. And I often say, what's the most competitive school you're applying to? What's the cutoff over the upper quartile of that school? Well, that's, we can use that as an initial goal,
Got it. And we have a question in the chat I wanted to make sure we get to. Someone asked, what is a realistic point increase that a student could expect after 3 to 4 months of test prep? And I guess it's in a way a multi-part question, because it depends SAT, ACT. It also depends on math versus verbal, right? So can you give it some sense of, and obviously every kid's different. So can you give some sense of what would be at least a realistic range?
Yeah, I mean, I consider for the SAT, and I do, I think partially geographically, I do a lot more SAT prep than ACT prep, but I consider, if for someone who does, 8 to 12 weeks of prep, 10 to 12, 150 to 200 point improvement is realistic.
In the aggregate, right? Out of 1,600 for the SAT, or?
Well, yes, out of there's 1,600 total score, but whatever your PSAT score comes in at, you could say it's very realistic to look at for score improvements into, say, like the 100, I'll just say the 100 to 200 point range, although really more like 150 to 200 point range, after 2 to 3 months of prep.
Right.
That's realistic. It's also realistic to look at improvements of 200 to 300 points if you're willing to put in, 4 to 6 months of prep.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the kind of improvement that I've, more or less consistently seen. And I think it's very reasonable to expect that kind of improvement. But, you do have to, start. Usually, let's say you're starting above the national average. Now, national average is around 1,000.
Right.
Students who are starting below that, there may be some other challenge associated with improving your score. But as long as there's not any other, factor, then typically that's a reasonable expectation. Now, again, after the first 150 to 200 points, then you have to start looking at, okay, is it realistic to see that next gain? That's not I wouldn't say that every student who makes that first gain is in a position to make the second gain, but it's usually a matter of willingness, desire, wanting to do it. But it is a tougher increase to make.
Yeah, the higher you go, the harder it is to eke out more points, because you're already at a pretty elevated level. So one thing that I know came up when we were first talking about this like a year ago, Ed, is your philosophy on how to prepare. And yeah, I'll take a stab at it, but then you can refine it. So one of the reasons I wanted to work with you is, as you explained it to me, what the SAT really tests is how good a kid is at taking the SAT. And therefore, the way to find that out is to do multiple simulated tests under very test-like conditions. Now that can be virtual, but it has to be the same amount of time. Otherwise it needs to be exactly just like the same as taking the real test. Then you can get a baseline score, and then you can discuss, well, let's set a goal, how high we can go. And then you benchmark it a bunch of times, and as if my kids are a good example, that you saw that improvement over time, and that both it builds the kid's confidence, and it also is realistic, and so they get a realistic sense of what they can achieve and what they can achieve. So that's what I liked, was your emphasis on testing in realistic conditions. I don't know.
Well, I think that and you described it well, the whole, you and the student and everyone seeing that steady progress. Like, I feel it's very important that you set realistic goals, and then you achieve those goals, and it just builds confidence along the way. And often people often ask, what will you do for their confidence? And I say, well, I don't do anything for their confidence except let them demonstrate, their increasing competence and results, and just make sure they acknowledge the progress they're making. And it does build confidence. But again, you've got to keep the goals realistic. So I'm always saying, all right, we're going to put on a student who scores, 1,200 and wants 1,500, and they want to talk about the 1,500. And I'll like, look, when you get 1,300, I'll talk to you about 1,400. And when you get 1,400, we'll talk about 1,500. But like, until that happens, just focus on the task that at hand, which is, what do I need to do differently to get the next 100 points? And then we'll talk about what you need to do differently to get the next one.
Great.
But that whole process, it builds confidence. It builds, and what you're saying too about the repeated test is, and I often say, I feel like the more I teach the test, it's like a logic test. It's very much a reasoning test. And you have to figure out, it's almost like you have to understand the game. You have to understand the logical. And that is also part of the whole thing about the first improvement and the second improvement. The first improvement can come just, you learn academically, you learn some new material, you apply it to the test, you can make 100, 200 point improvement. At some point, you have to learn the nature of the game. You have to understand what's going on this test and how they're constructing questions. And then you can kind of get over this, get into the really high percentile scores.
Right. And you get comfortable, the kid gets comfortable with the pacing and how much time each question takes. And then you also get, after repeated practice tests, you start to identify the specific issues that the kid is having, and then you can drill down on those. So whereas, okay, you're okay in areas, 1 through 8, but then areas 9 and 10, this is where the issues seem to be. So it's definitely a great approach, which I found very effective. And one other thing I want to mention is sort of Ed's manner is also very important. It's not only the substance, but he's a dad, and he's very supportive, makes the kids really comfortable, and creates a very, it's a very nice learning environment. And the same for his staff as well, because in earlier high school tests, my kids worked with some of Ed's staff, and I think they're all have a very good manner with the kids. They know how kids can get very stressed out and, can get distracted, and, working with teenagers takes a special kind of skill, so it's definitely something, when you're looking at who you want to select as your test prep partner, definitely think about that as well. One thing I definitely want to get into is, I keep hearing about there's going to be a new SAT, and things are changing. I guess, when are they changing, so that the parents on the call know, okay, am I going to take the current test? Am I going to take the new test? What's going on with that?
Well, this is the thing, and actually just this week, the College Board released a new tool to actually, with a mock of their new test. So the new digital SAT is on its way. if you're, it will be given for the first time for real in the fall, next fall, to kids who are currently in 10th grade.
Okay.
When they take the PSAT, if they do take the PSAT in the fall of their junior year, it will be on a computer. It will be the digital test. And that'll be the first in the United States. It's already being given around the world. The international SAT has already gone digital.
Now, just to be clear, going digital doesn't mean they're sitting at home on a laptop. They're
Very
in a
good point. Very
facility.
good point.
Okay.
It's not at home. It's in school. You go to school, you get on a computer, you do the test on a computer at school. It's digital, it's adaptive, and I can get into the details of how it's adaptive, but there is the degree to which you take one section, depending on how you do on that section, they give you another section. And then you take the second section, then you have your full score. And that process works for the math, one math section that everyone takes, and then you take the next one. Same thing for ELA.
Okay, so the parents of juniors, or I guess I should
Yeah.
include grandparents, aunts, uncles, whoever else, if your student that you're interested in is a junior, they're gonna be doing it the old school way with the
Old
two
school
number two
paper.
pencils and the
Yep.
Scantron. If they're a
Yep.
sophomore, are they definitely gonna take the SAT electronically, or are they maybe gonna take it
Now,
electronically?
this is the thing for the sophomores, a sophomore who starts early and takes the early test in the fall of their junior year, if they get it done by December, they can still take the paper test.
Okay,
So for kids, the current sophomores who as juniors were kind of on an accelerated track to take the SAT, they may well take their SAT the fall of their junior year, be done by December, and they'll do it on paper. But for the bulk of kids who are going to do it in the spring of their junior year, they'll take the PSAT in the fall on a computer, and then they'll take the SAT in the spring.
okay,
So if your child's a junior, it doesn't come into play. They will not be taking the digital test. If they're
got it.
sophomore and some people are going to want to just go with what's better known, which is the paper test, much better known.
Right.
You can get that done the fall of their junior year, and then make a decision about whether they want to do it again in the spring. But then obviously if we have parents of ninth graders, no choice, that'll be digital.
Okay, got it. All right. Yeah. So, yeah, and I don't know, maybe this isn't a good analogy, but one time I bought a car that was the first model year produced in a new factory. I learned later it was a total lemon. So I don't know if there's gonna be any jitters as they try to transfer to the electronic test, but.
Well, I do think that a lot of people are going to use that reasoning, which is, for people who are considering, should I have my junior, now this is, your current sophomore, your junior next year, should
Right.
have my junior wait till the spring, or should I kind of like encourage them to get started early, possibly even in the summer, to make sure that they're done and have the SAT score that we want by the end of the fall of the junior year, knowing they can do it on paper. I think that's going to be a motivating factor for a lot of people.
Got it. And presumably at your company, you're starting to prepare for this so that you'll be able to work with either kids that are doing the paper one next fall or doing the
Absolutely.
spring. So,
well, like I said, I just got that new tool that the College Board made available, and I know people who are developing a lot of additional tools and practice materials. So, by the end of this school year, by the summer, I'll be ready to work with kids prepping for the digital test. And again, it's going to be presentation. It's not going to be, the content is not, well, I was going to say the content is not supposed to be different. And the College Board has said it's not different, but even from the sample they released this week, they've brought back question types that they had retired and not used in a decade. And arguably they're testing the same skills, but they're doing it in a question type that they haven't used for a while.
That's very helpful. Thank you. So, and if you have more questions about sort of, if you have a sophomore and you're wondering about the electronic test, I'm sure Ed would be happy to speak with some of you separately. So feel free to email me, Chris@ivylife.org. I can put you in touch with Ed. we did have a question right at the beginning that I didn't get to yet, which is, and I don't know if you know this or not, or maybe it's even too early, but do we know what effect the pandemic has had on achievement on the SAT or SAT? Has it gone up? Has it gone down?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what effect it's had. I haven't seen any numbers on that, but I definitely think in terms of the scores submitted, I believe that scores submitted have gone up
Interesting.
because people have had the option not to send scores. So
Right. That makes sense. That's an
scores
effect
that are
of,
sent
yeah, are higher
I
because, yeah,
don't know. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if scores in general were higher because, you know, people didn't necessarily feel they needed to take the test, or some
right.
people didn't.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, so there's two level effects. Like there's one level of I'm not even going to take it. So those lower scores are no longer in the average, and then the scores aren't submitted. So it's
Right.
that's also increasing the average of those submitted. So we have another question, and I know you Ed offer in-person instruction as well as
Yeah.
virtual. And someone asked, is it more effective to do SAT prep in person with the teacher, or can it be done virtually with similar impact? So I don't know if you have a
Yeah.
view on that.
I definitely feel like it can be done. You know, I personally, I've been working in person, obviously, most of my career. I prefer in person, but I definitely feel it can be as effective online. And I mean, I can just share an anecdote. This just happened in the last couple of weeks. I've been working with this, I working with a student online. I worked with 2 years ago. I prepped her sister for the ACT. We did it during the pandemic, so everything had to be online. She made very strong improvement. Her sister's working with the SAT now, and she came in person to do a practice test. And after the result of the practice test, I actually emailed her mom, and I said I was surprised at the results, and I think maybe we should consider in-person sessions because I'm not sure that the online is being effective. And we did one online session and went through, and it was absolutely clear that as far as learning, as far as her learning what she needed to know, it had been totally effective. She had learned but as many kids are, she's a little nervous. She came in, she was nervous. She made a ridiculous number of careless errors. It had nothing to do with the effectiveness of learning online. It had more to do with being nervous in person.
Right. And I think my kids did a combination. I think a lot of it was virtual, and I thought
Yeah,
it
a
was,
lot of it was virtual. Yeah,
and they did
most of it
not.
was virtual.
Yeah,
So
they did not. I think they took a test in person
yeah.
and some in virtual and some in person. I think both the tests, you can do both. I think,
Well, that's the thing is I do like local kids who are taking the test virtual. I ask them to come in my office for practice tests. And kids who are not local, who are working virtually, I can usually arrange for them to go to the office of a tutor I know in their local neighborhood and take a practice test.
yeah.
Like just as a, courtesy that, we offer for other tutor students. So, I mean, I've done that on a number of occasions where another group will allow one of my students to come in and take a practice test in person.
So we're approaching the top of the hour. So I want to make sure I promise to give away a discount code for your services, Ed. So I'm going to do that now. Actually, I'm going to share my screen and show people how they can apply it too. So let me just very quickly share the IvyLife website. So if you want to see Ed's services, just go to ivylife.org, and then you scroll down to the home. On the home page, you scroll down here and just click on go to SAT Prep Store, and it's you'll see some information about Antoine Education. I explain my experience personally with Antoine Education. Then you can do a 1-hour consultation with Ed or an SAT prep package. The discount code works the same way either way, so I'll just use the prep package as an example. I believe this is 10 sessions and practice and 2 practice tests. I think, is that right, Ed? I think
Yeah, that's correct.
And then you add it to the cart, and then you view the cart. And by the way, you do not have to be a logged in IvyLife member to use this particular part. Some parts of the website are member only, other parts are for anyone. Anyone can do this. So if you're not an Ivy Life member and you're just watching, you could do this. So here you see it's added the test prep package to the cart. And then the code is Ivy Education, one word, Ivy, of course I can't type when I'm trying to do it live. Ivy Education 2022. So Ivy Education, one word, 2022. Click on apply coupon, and you'll see it takes off almost $500. So, and we maybe Victor, can you pop the code into the chat as well? The other thing you can do is, if you want to go directly to the information page, you can go to just ivylife.org/SAT/SAT, and that will take you directly to this page where you can look at the services, apply the discount, and purchase them. So I just want to make sure I got to that because I had promised ahead of time and I'd be in trouble if I didn't do that. So let me stop the share. So let's see. Victor, that's not quite right. I'm going to just correct that. It's Ivy Education 2022. So there you go. That's the proper discount code, the second one. And the website is ivylife.org/SAT. So if you have those two things, you have everything you need. The website as well as the 15% discount code. Okay, I want to make sure I got to that. So I don't believe we have any other questions. And I think I've gotten through my questions as well. So Ed, I want to give you the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to share with these stressed out parents of high schoolers and about how to get through this process?
Yeah, I guess I often find that, parents are much more nervous about this than students. And, arguably, perhaps, you as parents understand the stakes better than your children do. So though you may, but I think the key thing is just, get them on track. Don't let it get out of control. That's one of the things. Just keep it in bounds, get involved with the program, follow the program, get the tests done. And as I always say, like I said, the first set of sessions, wait for the results to come back, reassess when the results come back. If there's a part 2, which there often is, then you plan the part 2 after that. But just kind of keep it. There's so many things that they want to do, that they enjoy doing, and then so many things they need to do with applications, et cetera, that you want to just keep the test prep efficient. Don't let it get out of control. Don't, that's kind of my last word, best advice is just, keep it on track, keep it efficient, get the result you want, and call it a day.
Move on. Yeah, it was, I tell you, it's a big relief for now that I'm on the other side of the SAT process with my kids. It was really nice to have it in the rearview mirror and be done with it. One other thing I want to mention about Ed, because this was also really great about our experience with Ed as a family. And hopefully Ed won't be mad at me, but for saying this, but he was pretty generous with time. I could call him, he'd get back to me, and he's very generous with sort of the parental communications, I guess you could say. And I think that's, that was almost like Ed was saying, we almost needed it more than the kids did. It was like, are you doing okay? Is there anything we can do to support the kids? And it was very nice. I felt like he cared about the results. He cared about the kids. So I think that's something, definitely, going with a, as opposed to maybe one of the giant, I'm not saying the people at the giant test prep companies aren't nice, but I really think the personal touch that Ed brings was definitely helpful to our family. So I wanted to share that as well.
Yeah. Well,
And
I often say, I'm happy to talk to you, but I'll charge you to talk to your child.
that's right. So anyway, thanks again, Ed. Anyone that has any questions, feel free to email me. It's just Chris, CHRIS @ivylife.org. And I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Oh, there was a late breaking question. where do you do the in-person classes? I believe it's still in Park Slope,
Park
Brooklyn,
Slope,
right?
Brooklyn, yes.
Park Slope, Brooklyn. So I just got in that one last question that just arrived at 8:59 p.m. So glad I was able to answer that one as well. So again, Ed, thanks so much. Really
Sure, thank
appreciate,
you.
how you helped me and our kids, and also for doing this session with Ivy Life. And good luck with all your students this coming year. And
Thank you.
good luck handling the big rush that I'm sure will be coming with lots of stressed out kids and grown-ups. And again, anyone that has questions about Ivy Life, you can always just go to ivylife.org. If you're wondering about events we have coming up, just click on the events tab. We'll be populating that soon. I get this question a lot. We will be coming back to some in-person events, probably in January 2023 in Midtown Manhattan. So those longtime Ivy Lifers who used to come to the pre-pandemic meetings will be doing some morning meetings and some evening meetings. The traditional sort of networking gatherings that we've always done at Ivy Life, we will be resuming those in Midtown Manhattan in January 2023. Okay, thanks again, Ed.
Great,
Thanks
okay.
everyone for your patience and for listening. For those of you on the recording, that are listening to this or listening to the highlights, just remember just to go to ivylife.org/SAT, and that's where you can find more information about Ed and his services. All right, thanks again, everyone. Have a good evening.